Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. In this video, I am attempting to interpret and explain to you the essay Counterhistory and the Anecdote. This essay was written by the noted literary theorist Stephen Greenblatt and was included in his book Practicing New Historicism, which he wrote in association with Catherine Gallgher in the year 2000. Now, I'm going to give you a very brief context of this essay by explaining the new historicist way of analyzing literature. Greenblatt claims that the prevalent modes of literary and historical analysis at the time were too categorical. It means that the new historicists questioned the strong distinction, the strong boundaries that existed between literature and history, literature and politics, and literature and culture and so on. Greenblatt and other new historicist critics worked for the dissolution of these disciplinary boundaries. And how did they do it? They attempted to bring a cultural approach to literary criticism. Greenblatt's work, mainly on Shakespeare and Renaissance literature, shows us that literature and culture are not separate entities, are not separate categories. They are interrelated. If we look closely into the literature of an era and combine it with the study of other literary and non-literary texts of that period, we certainly get a glimpse of the cultural practices of that period. And literature of a certain period is also the result of the cultural forces of that time. So therefore, we can say that literary history and cultural history cannot be separated. Literature and culture are interrelated, interdependence. A study of one gives a view of the other. So, after new historicist criticism, literary criticism was no longer restricted to the critique of high literature and canonical works. New historicists insisted that any document, whether it's literary or non-literary, long account or short account, official document or unofficial document, a real account or an imaginary account, any document can be considered a social production, and any document could offer insightful details into the culture and history of that period. Thus, for new historicists, the textual and the contextual went hand in hand. It means that the texts gave a view of the context, the culture of that period, and the context, which was the cultural details of the era, could reveal hidden details about the texts that could be critiqued by a literary critic. So we notice an important trend here, we notice an important insight here. For new critics, there was nothing outside the text. Everything was the text. You had to study the text closely to bring all the insights that you can. But for the new historicist critics, everything is a text. Any document, any practice, anything that has happened, it could be a text, because they considered that it's a social production. Every cultural detail could enhance the credibility of the literary analysis and criticism of a particular text. And this is how text and context were interrelated. Another thing that new historicists stood for is the questioning of grand narratives, the challenging of dominant discourses of history. What it means is that when history appears as a monolithic structure, as a huge structure, a well-organized sequence of events without any odd diversities, without any events that seem to appear out of place, without any conflicts, that's the history that appears shady to these critics, to these new historicist critics. They think it's too well polished, and whenever a historical text appears this well polished, this stable, this undisputed, it means two things for the new historicists. It means, number one, that this historical text that appears to be so stable is produced under the influence of the people in power, that one or the other dominant ideology of the time has impacted its production. And the second thing that it means is that there's something hidden beneath this well-polished surface. What is hidden beneath this well-polished surface? Some authentic, some unofficial suppressed accounts of defeated people whose stories were considered to be too odd, too small, too insignificant to be included in the mainstream history. For example, history of the suppression of women, history of the exploitation of colonized people, history of the traumas of being a homosexual, of being disabled. These histories have often been excluded from mainstream histories, and the new historicists believed in finding and studying anecdotes and other non-literary texts to study these aspects of histories that have been overlooked by the mainstream historians. Now, among these non-literary texts, among these small narratives that we just talked about, the anecdote is the new historicist critics' favored device. What actually is an anecdote? An anecdote is a small, complete account of a very small event or an individual person. It may be real or fictional, but it's a very short story about something. New historicists use the anecdote in reading literary and historical texts against the grain. Against the grain means against the purpose for which the writer or historian had included the anecdote in his narrative. I'll give you a very small example in this. I hope it helps. While reading Gandhi, while reading the role of Mahatma Gandhi in the Indian independence, suppose the historian had inserted an anecdote about Dandi March, about Gandhi and Dandi March. So, of course, his purpose of including that anecdote was to show how Mahatma Gandhi was steering the independence movement in such a great manner. But imagine that I was a feminist scholar and I read that text, I read that Dandi March anecdote. But somehow I felt that the absence of women from the Dandi March somehow irks me, somehow irritates me, and I try to read that anecdote against the grain, against the purpose of the original writer, and I interpret a new meaning through that anecdote. So I have read the anecdote against the grain. So thus, reading between the lines, anecdotes helped new historicists capture the formation of counterhistories and the progress of counterhistories, and that is why the anecdote was so important for new historicists. Now, this essay that we are going to cover in this video will tell you why the anecdote was a favored device among the new historicist critics. It will tell you what kind of anecdotes appealed to the new historicists, and it will also tell you who were the noted theorists who made a difference to theory, who made a difference to literary criticism by the use of anecdotes, how these theorists contributed in the production and sustenance of counter histories and the methodology of literary criticism, and they also used anecdotes. So these are the topics that have been discussed in this essay and we are going to cover in this video. So let's begin with the texts here. I'm going to read a particular line and then simplify it for you. So let's dive right in. So I'll begin with the first paragraph of the essay that begins with the words, "But to the most mainstream historians, anecdotes are no account items. Tolerable, perhaps, as rhetorical embellishments, illustrations, or moments of relief from analytical generalization, but methodologically negatory." This line means that most mainstream historians, most modern historians who write mainstream histories, do not consider anecdote as a substantial and important part of their narrative. They find it tolerable, all right, we'll include it wherever some embellishment is required, some illustration, some example is required. But they don't consider it important in itself. They might include an anecdote, a small story, as an entertaining break between serious historical analysis. But as far as methodology goes, the respected methods of narrating history goes, anecdotes are considered negatory, of no important value whatsoever. When modern historians write about individual lives or small events, They usually stress their broad historical significance or generalizable typicality. Now, I already told you that the reason modern historians choose to begin with an anecdote or to insert anecdote as a footnote or within the text is only because they think the anecdote is a good example, is also representative of a trend that they are trying to analyze, the trend that they want to portray that was going on at that particular time of history. Such people and events usually come into view historically only at a distance from the trivialities and intricacies of daily life. In a cognitive retreat, where the reliability of the data of experience can be weighed and proportional significance assigned. The simple meaning of this whole line is that the historian, the modern historian, mainstream historian includes anecdote with a view that the reader may read the anecdote and thus make a decision about the typicality of the events. He doesn't have to really analyze the anecdote. That the historian is going to do for him later on with the narration of the anecdote later on. But what the anecdote does here is, for a modern historian, that it only presents itself as an example which can be viewed, and then we can weigh the anecdote and we can assign significance to the anecdote proportionally, whether the anecdote was significant and in expressing the meaning that the historian was trying to make or not. Certainly, there are notable exceptions to the rule. We will examine several in this chapter. So, he gives you an idea that this chapter is going to analyze many anecdotes, many examples which do not follow this rule. There are exceptions to the rule and they are going to analyze those exceptions in this chapter. But historians have generally been more interested in making an epistemological break with the past to create the protocol of objectivity than in producing the touch of the real. So, it means that if I'm a historian, I'm a mainstream historian trying to create history that becomes popular, that people approve of. What I'm looking for here is for people, for the readers, for society to understand that my historical text was written objectively, that it's not partisan, it is not biased towards one person or the other, one political thought or the other. I want to create a discourse of objectivity around my text. So that's one thing that they want. To follow the protocol of objectivity. Also, they are more interested in making an epistemological break. They want for people, for readers to admit that whatever information that they have revealed in the text, that creates an epistemological break. New knowledge has been created, something new has been revealed, is what they want people to believe. Number one, that there's an epistemological break with this work, and second, there's a protocol of objectivity that has been followed. They are interested in these two things rather than being interested in producing a touch of the real. See, the touch of the real stands here for anecdote. It also stands here for the new historicist way of analyzing texts. They try to trace the touch of the real in the text that they analyze. So, modern historians, mainstream historians are not interested in producing the touch of the real. That is why they do not favor the anecdote as of primary importance. They want to create an epistemological break with the past, and they want to do it within the protocol of objectivity. They are not interested in producing the touch of the real, and that is why the anecdote is not their favored instrument of presenting history. It might therefore seem odd that literary critics would invoke history through anecdotes. Now here Greenblatt comes to the new historicist approach. The new historicists wanted to approach history through anecdotes. They did not want to rely just on the highbrow literary texts or the monolithic historical texts. What they wanted was to take the anecdote, to use the anecdote as a tool and use the anecdote to discover something that has not been said, that has not been analyzed. Indeed, the anecdote as a form has often been counterpoised against more ambitiously comprehensive historical narratives. It means that the anecdote and more comprehensive historical narratives, larger historical narratives, stand in opposition to each other. They do not stand in a similar direction, they stand in opposition to each other. The completeness of the anecdote, the fact that the anecdote is a complete story and can be read by the reader in whichever way he wants, in whichever sense he wants to read it, threatens the comprehensiveness of narrative histories. It threatens the texture, the smooth surface that is showed to the world, and thus the anecdote threatens to puncture the historical narrative. Our late colleague Joel Fineman, for example, claimed that any petit récit would puncture the historical grand récit into which it was inserted. All anecdotes, simply as complete little stories unto themselves, perforate the context of narrative explanation. Joel Fineman, one of the new historicist critics and a colleague of Greenblatt and Gallgher's, claimed that any small narrative, any petit récit would puncture the grand narrative, the grand récit into which it was inserted. And why does a small narrative threaten to puncture the grand narrative? Because they're so complete little stories unto themselves. They are complete stories. When a reader reads an anecdote, it's up to his approach as to what sense he makes of that anecdote. I insert an anecdote into my historical analysis with my intention. But when a reader reads that anecdote, the reader's approach is the factor through which the anecdote will make sense to the reader. So therefore, suppose a reader reads an opposite sense into an anecdote that I put into the narrative for some other purpose. The anecdote has threatened right here to puncture my purpose, puncture the grand narrative that I was trying to create. Therefore, all anecdotes, simply as complete little stories unto themselves, perforate the context of narrative explanation. The anecdote produces the effect of the real, the occurrence of contingency, by establishing an event as an event within and yet without the framing context of historical successivity. So, see, this is again how the anecdote is so self-dependent, so compact and complete that it is an event within an event. It is a smaller event within a larger historical narrative. That's how it is an event within an event, and also it does not require any successive explanation by the historian. What happened after that is not required by the historian because that account is so complete in itself. Therefore, its completeness threatens to puncture the smooth surface of historical narratives. The opening of history that is affected by the anecdote. Here, the author says that a historical narrative, a historical book, a text, usually begins with an anecdote. The whole and the rim using psychoanalytic language. If we use the psychoanalytic way of interpreting science, the anecdote is the whole and the teleological narration that comes after the anecdote in the historical text is the rim. Traced out by the anecdote within the totalizing whole of history is something that is characteristically and ahistorically plucked up by a teleological narration. It seems like the anecdote, as said earlier, has created a puncture, and the puncture is plugged up by teleological narration. The teleological narration is trying to contain the puncture, is trying to create an embrasure for the puncture. So, plugged up by teleological narration that, though larger than the anecdote itself, is still constitutively inspired by the seductive opening of anecdotal form. The teleological narration would not have been there. It was inspired only by the anecdote at the opening. Without the anecdote in the opening, the teleological narration, although it is bigger than the anecdote, will lose its structure, will lose its substance. And there's also another possibility that the anecdote and the teleological narration is now making up a historical text. The text can further be summarized into an anecdote and used somewhere else with further teleological narration, and this cycle goes on and on, where one narrative becomes anecdote and inspires more teleological narration, and whatever discourse is formed again becomes an anecdote and is followed by further teleological narration. This sequence can go on and on and on, and it started with an anecdote. This is the strength of the anecdote as a form in the new historicist critical practice. Now I should give you an example. For example, the same thing, the historical text about Indian independence that I am reading might begin with an anecdote about Mahatma Gandhi. It began with an anecdote about Mahatma Gandhi, and then the teleological narration begins, and the historian analyzes what that anecdote stands for, what's the trend that it's portraying. After the teleological narration is done, and there are several anecdotes and there are several teleological narrations, and thus the historical text is created, the historical text as a whole, the whole movement for independence in India can be used as a small anecdote, perhaps maybe talking when someone's talking about South Asian countries, or someone's talking about countries that have been colonized by the empire. So this whole narrative, the whole historical text now becomes an anecdote in itself. This is the circumscription the author talks about. It goes on and on. An anecdote inspires teleological narration. It results into a historical narrative. The historical narrative can further be used as an anecdote somewhere else in some other context, and thus this cycle goes on and on. In Feynman's view, the miniature completeness of the anecdote necessarily interrupts the continuous flow of larger histories. At the anecdote's rim, one encounters a difference in the texture of the narrative, an interruption that lets one sense that there is something, the real, outside of the historical narrative. So Feynman suggests that the miniature completeness of the anecdote interrupts the continuous flow of larger histories. In a larger historical text, the anecdote interrupts the flow of the narrative. The anecdote is so complete in itself that it appears as a puncture, it appears as a hole, it appears as a break from the teleological narration. Also, there is a possibility that the reader might interpret the anecdote in his own terms, according to his own approach. Therefore, the flow of the historical narrative is somehow interrupted. At the anecdote's rim, one encounters a difference in the texture of the narrative. Of course, teleological narration is analysis, are statements, whereas the anecdote, as said earlier, has the touch of the real. It's a story. It's a story about something that really happened, or an imaginative account of something that happened. So there is a touch of the real. There's a change of texture. When you go on reading about Indian independence, into all the analysis, when the anecdote is inserted, you certainly feel a difference in the quality of text, in the quality of narrative. From generalizations, from statements, from analysis, you encounter something that actually happened. And it lets one sense that there is something, the real, outside of the historical narrative, that whatever is real, it suggests, is outside the historical narrative. It thus lends the historical narrative an artificiality, as a constructedness, as if it is not something real, as if it depends upon something real and is only a construct. The anecdote thereby exposes history. I think this is clear by now. that the anecdote punctures, it's a hole, it's plugged up by teleological narration, and it stands there to threaten the continuous flow of history, and also the reader might interpret the anecdote in his own terms. So therefore, it in a way, the anecdote exposes history. Now, Greenblatt attempts an explanation of whatever Fineman has said above in the above lines, which I already discussed with you. So I'm going to just read it and explain wherever necessary. He goes on to explain that these openings provoke their own contextualizations, like the anecdote can be picked up and be placed in some other contexts and be interpreted in some other sense. So, provoke their own contextualizations inside new teleological narratives which strive for completeness, themselves becoming summarizable, and therefore once again separable from the unending sequence of events. Thus, the teleological narrative keeps striving for completeness and ends up becoming an anecdote itself and being used for teleological narration somewhere else. Each explanatory narrative can be summed up in a further anecdote, which I said earlier, which makes a new tier and provokes yet another contextualization. Ultimately, then, history perpetuates itself through these punctures. So, this is how grand history, grand narratives perpetuate themselves. They perpetuate themselves through these punctures only, but only because why it perpetuates through these punctures? Because the anecdote is irritatingly antithetical to historical discourse. Whatever the historical discourse says, the anecdote is irritatingly antithetical. It punctures it, and it is through these punctures that we encounter history. So Feynman here gives a formal explanation of the anecdote's repercussions. What are the anecdote's repercussions? We've already discussed it above, that the anecdote is so complete in itself that it will inspire opposing inferences. It will inspire people to interpret the anecdote in their own terms. They will not care about what the particular historical narrative is trying to use the anecdote for. Since the anecdote is so complete, the story begins and ends in the particular small account, it will be used somewhere else with other new surrounding sequences. It's independent. It can go anywhere. It can be used with any other approach as well. And therefore, the comprehensive historical narratives, their progress will be impeded by the independence of these anecdotes. Roland Barthes had described a slightly different antagonistic relation between history and the anecdote in the late 1960s. So in the 60s, Barthes described an opposite relationship between history and the anecdote. We have already seen in the previous paragraphs that the relationship between the history and anecdote is not so good. Anecdote punctures history. History is impeded. The growth of historical narrative is impeded by the anecdote because the anecdote has a mind of its own. So what we see here is that Barthes is correct that there is a slightly different, opposite relation between history and the anecdote, but a slightly different one. What is the slightly different one here? He defined the discourse of history in modern times as one that constantly tries to efface the difference between the signified and the referent by presenting its own narrative sequence, the signified as identical to a sequence of past events, the referent. So, a very long sentence, a complicated one. So, I'm going to break it down and explain it to you. He defined the discourse of history in modern times as one that constantly tries to efface the difference. Now, modern history tries to erase the difference. Difference between what? Between the signified and the referent. What is the signified? He explains. Narrative sequence is signified as identical to a sequence of past events. Past events are the referent. How do we understand signified and referent in this case? I'll give you an example. I see a small boy hitting a tree with a rock, and I consider him as not a very nice person to be harming the tree. So this is my narrative. I saw a boy, he was not so nice, he was hitting a tree with a rock. Maybe he was trying to harm a bird, maybe he was trying to break a branch, I don't know, but this is my narrative. So do you see that if the boy was not harming the tree, suppose the boy was trying to help a bird, he was trying to break a fruit from the tree, or he was trying to save a bird's nest from a nasty bigger bird, the event was something else. The referent was something else than my narrative of that event, my explanation of that event. The event, that is the referent, and my narration, that is the signified, were not identical. But Roland Barthes says that in modern history, the event and its narration are taken to be one and the same thing. When historical discourses are created, are written, it appears that the historian wants to say that whatever he is saying is actually what happened. Whereas this is just his perspective, his point of view that he is presenting in that historical narration. But this illusion of signified and referent is exposed when some mere notation, often an anecdote incompletely digested by the larger narrative, divulges a different reality, which is behind or beside the narrative surface and composed of things that historians cannot assimilate into typicality or coherent significance. So how does one come to know that there's actually a difference that exists between the signified and the referent, between the narration and the events that happen? It appears when an anecdote incompletely digested, it's written in the essay, an anecdote incompletely digested by the larger narrative. The larger narrative could not digest completely the anecdote. What does this mean? That the anecdote stood out. The anecdote did not go with the flow. The anecdote that I talked about in the beginning of this lecture, that Indian independence historical discourse and Mahatma Gandhi, but I saw an anti-feminist element in that anecdote. I could read it according to my view. This is an incompletely digested anecdote. It divulges a different reality which is behind or beside the narrative surface. This reality was somewhere behind the narrative surface. It was beside the narrative surface, and it was composed of things that historians cannot assimilate into typicality or coherent significance. It means that perhaps in the history of Indian independence, the historian's focus was not gender relations. He was not looking into what was happening with women, because that was a family matter, that was a cultural matter. He was here writing about an independence struggle. So he could not bring that anecdote completely in a way that it could be digested in the narration. Its typicality was questionable. He could not assimilate it into a coherent significance, is what Greenblatt says here. This effect of the real momentarily betrays the incompleteness or formality of historical narrative. So this effect of the real, the anecdote, for a moment, it shows you the incompleteness of historical narrative, their formality of these historical narratives, which is only to say its discursive nature. It's discursive nature, it's a discourse. And so, as in Fineman's account, notational anecdotes work against the historical grain. Whatever the purpose of a historical discourse is, the anecdote, as in Fineman's account earlier, so in Barthes' account here, it works against the historical grain and not as the historian intended it to. It did not work according to the wishes of the historian. It did something else. It was interpreted as something else. It inspired another teleological narration. It was fixed somewhere else in some other context. It created some other meaning, and therefore the anecdote is a little annoying, a little irritating for the mainstream historian. Like Fineman and Barthes, new historicists linked anecdotes to the disruption of history as usual, not to its practice. The undisciplined anecdote appealed to those of us who wanted to interrupt the big stories. Now, at the beginning of this lecture, I made it a point to tell you guys that we are going to study why the anecdote was so important to the new historicists? What was the appeal of the anecdote? Why did it appeal so much to these critics? Here's the answer. They linked anecdotes to the disruption of history, not to the practice of history, but its disruption. So what did the new historicists want to do? They wanted to disrupt the grand narratives. They wanted to question, challenge the monolithic historical discourses. The undisciplined anecdote appealed to those who wanted to interrupt the big stories. So whoever wanted to question the received notions of history, the received discourses of history, they found the anecdote an appealing medium to do it. We sought the very thing that made anecdotes ciphers to many historians, a vehement and cryptic particularity that would make one pause or even stumble on the threshold of history. So what made anecdotes such a problem for many historians but such an interesting mode for new historicists? Its particularity. Anecdotes are particular. They are an account of particularities. So when one looks at particularities expressed in the anecdote, one stops and one thinks and one questions. In the same example that I gave you about the Gandhi discourse, when I saw a feminist a question in that anecdote, it was the particularity of the anecdote. It said something about the women, it said something about something that was happening to women, or there was an absence of women from something. I saw that because the anecdote was particular about it. Now this particularity would make one pause and question. I paused and I questioned. This is the cryptic particularity, strong cryptic particularity of the anecdotes that appealed to the new historicist critics. But for this purpose, it seemed that only certain kinds of anecdotes would do. Outlandish and irregular ones held out the best hope for preserving the radical strangeness of the past by gathering heterogeneous elements. Now, so many important elements in this one sentence. What kind of anecdotes did the new historicists need? They needed only certain kinds of anecdotes, and the kind would be they needed outlandish and irregular anecdotes that did not fit anywhere. This kind of anecdotes presented the best hope for preserving the radical strangeness of the past. This is another important point, that the new historicists considered the past as radically strange. See the difference? In the beginning, we talked about historical discourses, grand narratives that brought to us the suggestion that perhaps history was linear, it was stable, it was not strange. I'm sorry. But new historicists say that there was a radical strangeness in the past, and that radical strangeness could only be preserved by studying anecdotes that are outlandish and irregular ones. So, and these anecdotes preserve the radical strangeness of the past by collecting heterogeneous elements that are not similar, that are not homogeneous, elements that are different but yet strange. For example, ephemeral details, some details that a historian might have missed out on, some overlooked anomalies, there were some mistakes, those were overlooked, suppressed anachronisms, something that did not seem right for the moment, into an ensemble where ground and figure, history and text continually shifted. Now, we just heard Barthes saying that he has a problem with modern historians erasing the difference between the referent and the signified, between the narrative and the events. Here, new historicists wanted that the ground and the figure, the history and the text, they continually shifted. They wanted the shift. They did not want to erase that difference between history and text, between the ground and the figure. They wanted to preserve that difference. Now, this kind of anecdotes, the ones that new historicists found very interesting, they would not, as in the old criticism, epitomize epochal truths but would instead undermine them. So now these anecdotes would not support the epochal truths, the things that have been passed on to us through history as to be true forever. But instead, these anecdotes would question such truths. How can they be epochal truths? They would undermine them, they would challenge them. These anecdotes would be even more undisciplined than the previous anecdotes we talked about. The anecdotes would open history or place it askew so that literary text could find new points of insertion. So now history is open for question through anecdotes. Through these anecdotes, literary texts would find new points of insertion, new points of entry, where they could find a gap and bring out something that was not on the surface earlier. Perhaps texts would even shed their singular categorical identities. In the beginning of this lecture, I also told you that new historicists wanted to erase the boundaries between history and literature. Here it is. Perhaps texts would even shed their singular categorical identities, their division into literary and historical. At the very least, history could be imagined up as a part of their contingency, a component of their time-bound materiality, an element of their predictability. Greenblatt insists that history could at the very least be imagined as part of these texts' contingency, a component of their time-bound materiality, that these literary texts are also material, they are also time-bound, and history should be understood as a component of their materiality, an element of their unpredictability, that literary texts, historical texts as such are unpredictable, and history is only one component of their unpredictability, of their materiality.